The Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC, live from the Greene Space today, our cozy little theater here on the ground floor, facing Varick Street at WNYC on the second day of President's Week, 2 days before George Washington's actual birthday. Little history, Washington's birthday got moved to the third Monday in February in 1971, if you didn't know that, under the Uniform Monday Holiday Act, the better for the ski vacation industry, I guess. In fact, other vacation and shopping industries too. Memorial Day, Labor Day, Columbus Day, and Martin Luther King's birthday, once it was created, are all included in this. Exempt are the 4th of July, because it would be weird to celebrate a holiday called the 4th of July and like the 2nd of July or the 5th of July. Also Veterans Day, out of respect, always November 11th for the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and Christmas and New Year's. And for President's Week, as opposed to President's Day, some school districts have it, some don't. I think it's a function of teachers' union collective bargaining agreements in New York City and some other places, and how the unions and the districts most wanted to distribute school days and days off from school. So here we are. I know some of you listening today have President's Week. Some of you just had President's Day. Now, we know George Washington was good at many things: being a general, being a president, admitting to his parents that Russia chopped down his cherry tree. Well, not exactly, but he didn't say crooked Alexander Hamilton chopped down the cherry tree, or the FBI chopped down the cherry tree. And in fact, there's an article this week by Thomas Pickering and James Stoutenberg about something else you may not have realized Washington was good at. The article is headlined, "Did George Washington Predict Donald Trump?" And I'll read you a few excerpts. It says, in September 1796, George Washington, weary of partisan combat just 8 years after the ratification of the Constitution and the founding of the nation, wrote a farewell address explaining why he would not seek a third term. His message is worth remembering in our current political moment. And a paragraph later, it says, he foresaw the possibility of foreign influence over our political system and the rise of a president whose ego and avarice would transcend the national interest, raising the threat of despotism. It says Washington certainly had great confidence, but in his address, he didn't brag about his accomplishments. On the contrary, he beseeched the Almighty to soften the impact of his errors and expressed hopes that the country would forgive them. He established a standard for presidential self-deprecation out of the fear that a president of grossly inflated ego could become a threat to democracy. Then a little later it says, some of Washington's most prescient warnings were about the dangers of factionalism. He wrote that should one group, quote, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, gain domination over another, the result could be, quote, a more formal and permanent despotism. He said the despot's rise would be fueled by disorders and miseries that would gradually push citizens, quote, to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. Sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able and more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purpose of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. George Washington said that in 1796. And as if envisioning the political tribalism and 24/7 cable news culture of today, he even urged political leaders to restrain, quote, the continuous mischiefs of political parties. The spirit of party, he wrote, serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. And I'll conclude this with the part of the article that says, and then Washington arrived at one of his greatest concerns, the ways in which hyperpartisanship could open the door, quote, to foreign influence and corruption, which find a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. Wow, George Washington's own words. Farsighted indeed, right? And with that, here we are on February 20th, 2018. My first guest today is also concerned with the common good. In fact, that's the name of the new book by former Clinton Labor Secretary Robert Reich, long identified with progressive politics and progressive economics. He was a Bernie Sanders supporter in the Democratic primaries in 2016, and even as the Trump tax law is becoming a little more popular, according to the latest polls, Reich reminds us on his Twitter feed that since that law took effect, stock buybacks have surged to $88 billion compared to what he calls the paltry $2.5 billion of employee bonuses that corporations say they'll give out, revealing the bonuses for what they are, a fig leaf to disguise the big buybacks. Robert Reich is also a policy professor at UC Berkeley, and The Common Good is his 15th book. And with that, please welcome Robert Reich to the Greene Space. Nice to see you in person. Thank you for coming.
Well, Brian, it's nice to see you in person, and also what a change from the times we've talked before. You have a real people here.
Real people, human
real
beings.
People.
Well, you don't know.
It's nice to see all of you.
They may be androids, but can we start on some news and then go to the book? Sure enough, there's an article in the Times today that says the tax bill is becoming more popular, though to not mislead people about what that means, it's gone from 90% unpopular among Democrats down to 80% unpopular. But still, it seems to coincide with a shrinking Democratic advantage in the generic question, who do you want to control Congress next year, and a few-point uptick in Trump's own favorability ratings. How do you see the tax law economically and politically?
Well, there's no question, Brian, that the tax law is a huge giveaway to big corporations and the wealthy. And it's not just my opinion. Almost every study that's been done, bipartisan, nonpartisan, has come up with exactly the same reality. This was sold to the American people, however, as a big tax break for the middle class and for the working class. It's a lie. And the question that I come back to, and the question underlying my book, is how do you deal with lies? How do you deal with a kind of a president and a Fox News propaganda machine that will continue to tell the public the opposite of what actually is, tax law being one obvious example?
Your tweet about buybacks versus bonuses, can you elaborate on that?
Buybacks, stock buybacks, are not new. They were legalized in 1982 by Ronald Reagan's Securities and Exchange Commission, basically a device to, it's kind of like using steroids to create an artificial impression that stocks are in demand. So companies buy back their own stocks, create the impression of demand, that drives stock prices higher. Again, temporarily, it feels good temporarily. It's good for CEOs whose stock buy their stocks. A lot of what they are paid is in stocks and stock options, but it does nothing for the underlying company. This company's not investing in research and development. It's not investing in new plant or equipment. It's certainly not investing in its workers. And yet that was the idea, and that was the selling point behind the big new tax cut for corporations, that suddenly they're going to take all this money, not buy back their own stock, but actually invest it.
Your tweet suggests, I guess that suggests there's something wrong with buybacks. I've seen it, the buyback portrayed also as just a sign of confidence by companies that the economy is going to grow, that their stocks are going to grow.
Well, if it's a sign of confidence by companies, then what the companies are doing, then you've got to ask, well, why are companies essentially telling some of their shareholders to sell their shares of stock to the company? I mean, there's a little bit of duplicity involved in that from the beginning. But more importantly, I think it reveals a misunderstanding about what drives economic growth and what drives investment. Essentially, the only way you get companies to invest in R&D, in workers, in their plant and equipment is if they think that they are going to have more customers in the future. And that only happens if there are likely to be more customers, if people in our great middle class and working class and poor have more money in their pockets to turn around and buy stuff. But if we have a shrinking middle class, as we have had for at least 2 decades or more, and if we have a working class and poor that are less and less able to turn around and buy anything, then there is a crisis of aggregate demand. That is, companies rationally are not going to invest, and that's exactly what's happened.
Are you worried at all about this? Here's an article from today by Greg David. Maybe you know him. He writes about economics nationally and locally a lot for Crane's New York Business here in New York. Headline, Cuomo says Trump tax law hurts, but my paycheck just grew. Subhead, Republicans intend to portray Democrats' criticism as rhetoric. And he writes, my paycheck went up 4.4% last week, the most it has increased this decade. Did your take-home pay go up? And then he goes on to say how even calculating for whatever he's going to lose in terms of his state and local tax deduction on his federal taxes by being a New Yorker, he's still going to wind up with a net plus. And so are you concerned at all that the Republicans will successfully portray the Democrats' criticism of the tax bill as rhetoric once people see what's actually in their paychecks?
Well, I think there's certainly room for concern about that, because what the Republicans have done very cleverly is to front load the tax bill so that all the benefits are there in the first year and second year, and then gradually they are eroded. Most people start losing ground in terms of the taxes that they pay. They have got to pay more and more, that is. More and more of the tax cut goes to the wealthy over time. And yet people initially feel that they're doing better. Also, withholding taxes and the withholding tables are designed so people are getting kind of more benefits than they think, than they actually are. I mean, it's kind of a false withholding of a minimal withholding of taxes to begin in the beginning. So all of this means that people are being duped. And the question again is, when will people discover what the truth is?
Just one more thing on this, about the deficits this tax cut is projected to incur. Do both parties just go back and forth on this, depending on who's in power? As recently as October 2015, you posted a video called Austerity 101, the 3 reasons Republican deficit hawks are wrong. Now it seems like the Democrats are the deficit hawks. So were deficit hawks wrong in 2015 but are right today?
The 3 reasons that I posted for why deficit hawks are wrong, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, are still valid. That is, if the deficit as a percentage of the total economy is declining as a percentage of the economy, even though in absolute terms it might be going up, then we shouldn't worry. It's only when the deficit as a percentage of the economy keeps going up, that's the time to worry. Secondly, when the deficit is spent on things like research and development or education or job training or infrastructure, that may grow the economy, which means the deficit as a proportion of the economy will continue to shrink. That's not bad, that's good. It's only when the deficits are used for things like, for example, a gigantic tax cut for the wealthy, that you have to worry, because it's not going to grow the economy. Trickle-down economics is, let me be very clear about this, a cruel joke. It does not work. We've tried it before. It's one of those few economic theories that have been tried and have been shown to be absolutely wrong.
And the buybacks are an example of that, because the people who are getting the benefits from the law find a way to concentrate the wealth among themselves?
Of course. Well, the corporate buybacks, using profits for buybacks, artificially creating an uptick in shares of stock, or at least preventing stocks from declining as much as they otherwise would, helps mostly people who own shares of stock. And as we now know, and a lot of good research has now been done on this, and that is the richest 1% of Americans own 40% of all shares of stock. The richest 10% of Americans own 80% of all shares of stock. So obviously, as the stock market is artificially kept up with profits that are generated in part by a tax cut, that's another way in which the wealthy members of our society get a big benefit.
Listeners, my guest, if you want to call in and talk to him, is former Clinton Labor Secretary Robert Reich, whose new book is called The Common Good. By the way, I'll mention that you can see Robert Reich in person tomorrow night at 7 o'clock at the Barnes & Noble on the Upper West Side, Broadway and 82nd Street. That's Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, Barnes & Noble, Upper West Side. Those of you here in our audience at the Greene Space, if you have a question for Robert Reich, you can raise your hands. We'll come around. And anybody listening, you can call in, 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. By the way, I neglected to mention, as we usually do at the beginning of Greene Space shows, that you can not only listen to the show when we're in the Greene Space, you can also watch, because we have a live video stream from here. So you can go to thegreenspace.org, or you can go to the WNYC Facebook page. Either of those, the Greene Space, that's green with an E at the end of it, so the Greene Space.org, or to the WNYC Facebook page, and you can find the live stream, and I'll wave hello to you. All right, The Common Good. Name of the book is The Common Good. You identify 3 structural breakdowns leading to the politics of today. And on the first one, you and George Washington definitely agree. A politics defined by whatever it takes to win. You don't think it was always like this?
At various points, it has been like this, Brian, but we've had periods of reform in which we've said, essentially, as a nation, that our politics has got to be serious about the common good. We've got to make sure that there's not too much money in politics. We did this for the first time in the 1840s. We did it again in the first decade of the 20th century, the progressive era. We did it again right after Watergate. We've kept big money out of politics. We have to go back. We've got to do it again. Big money is now infecting our politics as never before. We also have got to reaffirm, it seems to me, that the whatever it takes mentality, whether we're talking about politics or even the profitability of companies or even individuals, if it's leaders who are saying essentially, my only responsibility is to get more wealth or more power for my company or for myself or for my political party, they are violating a public trust. That the most essential, basic public trust is the country as a whole, the world as a whole. That is the public good. Now, it may sound odd and quaint and a little corny to say it, and that just shows how far we've come from the days when we used to talk about the common good. But it is not. We've got to revive that kind of language, and we've got to revive that kind of discussion.
You trace this back somewhat to Watergate and the Robert Bork confirmation hearings as 2 of the relatively recent posts. Now, one way to look at those moments is that Democrats were the aggressors against the party in power in those instances, against Nixon, against Bork. Are you blaming your own party for starting it in the modern era to any degree?
I think the blame really is everywhere. I don't think it is fair to blame Democrats or Republicans. By the way, I'm not kind of making a false equivalence. I do think that the Democrats have been overall more responsible than the Republicans. But having said that, let me also say that since the 1980s, the Democrats have been drinking out of the same political financial trough as the Republicans in terms of big money. Big money from corporations, big money from Wall Street, and that has undermined the integrity of the Democratic Party as a voice of working class people, as a voice of middle class and poor people. I remember, and some people just looking at some of the people who are sitting here today might also remember, not accusing anybody of looking my age, but I'm just saying you might also remember a time in our history after the Second World War, that first 3 decades, when we seriously were worried about the common good. There was an anti-Vietnam War movement. There was a civil rights movement. There was a feminist movement. But beyond that, we also had political action. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Environmental Protection Act, Medicare, Medicaid. We took seriously these ideals that were part of the common good. I'm not suggesting we achieved them, but part of what is, I think, admirable about America is particularly the points in time when we sought to achieve these ideals. Not that we achieved them, but we tried. And I worry that we are not even trying any longer.
You bring up history that some people alive today might remember, and I'm curious about your own take now on the 90s and hyperpartisanship at that time when you were in office as labor secretary under President Clinton. There was, as I recall it, this irrational, character-assassinating anti-Clintonism that sprung up, accusing him of everything from treason for avoiding Vietnam to murder, and not just of Vince Foster. There were people raising other alleged incidents, and arguably the first modern Trump-like figure to really rise to power, Newt Gingrich, became Speaker of the House. And they took Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky all the way to impeachment, as you know, as a hyper-partisan attack. Are things worse today?
I think they are worse today. They're worse today partly because that hyper-partisanship has been institutionalized. You know, you get a Speaker of the House who says his primary goal is to prevent the President of the United States from having a second term. I mean, that can't and should never be the primary goal of the Speaker of the House. The primary goal of people who are in politics ought to be the good of the nation. The consistent, repeated putting the party before the public, the notion that basically politics is a blood sport, that there are no institutional norms, that trust in the institutions of our democracy is no longer important. That to me is, having been institutionalized since Newt Gingrich, and I will say Newt Gingrich, to me, was the big beginning of all of that. It's been institutionalized to a point where it's now taken for granted. And it wasn't always that way. Brian, when I got to Washington, my first job was as an intern for Robert F. Kennedy when he was a senator in the late 60s. And I remember Republicans and Democrats working together. They were good friends. Even the interns and all of the staff worked together, and they were serious about improving the country.
Let's take a question for you from here in the Greene Space. Sir, hello.
How are you? A different topic, if you don't mind, Dr. Reich. I wonder if you subscribe to the notions of the late economist Hyman Minsky, who argued that in the absence of prudential regulation, financial crises like 2008, 1929, whatever, are not just anomalies but inevitabilities. And if so, if you agree with that, does it follow that, the Trump administration is laying the groundwork for yet another crisis?
I do agree largely with that, and I think the Trump administration, not only by deregulating the Dodd-Frank, which in my view was not even adequate to deal with Wall Street and the financial institutions and the betting parlor that finance has become, but to dismantle part of Dodd-Frank and to fill the government up with financial people and lobbyists is begging for another financial crisis. I think that it's almost inevitable.
Ironically, Trump ran on a little bit of populist economics in addition to his race baiting. He ran against Wall Street and the concentration of wealth. He ran against pharmaceutical industry ripoffs. I know it's ironic, right? But he did, if you transcribe his campaign speeches. He ran for no changes to Social Security and Medicare benefits, the opposite of, say, Paul Ryan. And Trump ran on infrastructure here rather than military adventurism abroad. And, of course, he ran on trade protectionism. And all of that was part of Steve Bannonism, too, in addition to the white Christian heteropatriarchal supremacy parts. But Trump seems to have doubled down on the identity politics, but walked away from almost all the economic populism. Does it look that way to you?
Yeah. And remember, 2016 will go down in history as the year that presidential politics became populist in terms of economic populism. And on the right you had, and on the Republican side you had, Donald Trump saying all those things, appealing to a base that was disenfranchised, angry, felt with some justification that they had been ignored and were on a downward escalator and had been for years. And meanwhile, on the left or on the Democratic side, you had the emergence of Bernie Sanders. Nobody expected Bernie Sanders to do well. I mean, he was the most improbable candidate. And before Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump came to prominence, almost every insider in Washington assumed that Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton had it made. But they all overlooked the degree of anger that was welling up in the American populace. Because remember, since 1978-79, wages for most people have gone absolutely nowhere if you adjust for inflation. Almost all the economic gains, and the economy continued to grow almost at the same pace as before, but almost all the economic gains since the late 70s, early 1980s, have gone to the top or near top. And that has meant, the most profound aspect of that degree of inequality has meant that a great deal of wealth, a great deal of money concentrated at the top has been able to change the rules of the game politically, to rig the system for their benefit. So when politicians, and this wasn't just Donald Trump, it wasn't just Bernie Sanders, even Hillary Clinton started talking about the rigging, the deck being stacked in favor of those at the top. When politicians were saying that, they were reflecting what pollsters were telling them, that most Americans really did not trust the system any longer. They didn't trust that the system was going to be delivering for them. If the Democrats don't understand that that is real, that that is what they must address in the midterms and also in 2020, then we're just going to have more and more Donald Trumps forever.
So I'm just curious how much of a protectionist you are as a progressive economics person. Bernie Sanders, who you endorse, ran as one, overlapping with Trump on that point. But I think I see the backlash to Trump provoking a new sort of wistfulness for free trade agreements like NAFTA and the TPP, of all things, among progressives who don't like Trump's obnoxious nationalism and see his withdrawal from trade pacts as a part of that. Where are you on this?
Well, first of all, we've got to understand that the biggest threat to job security is not trade, it's technological change. In fact, artificial intelligence is coming along over the next 5 years. 4.5 million drivers are going to be out of jobs. Many of them truck drivers, many middle-class jobs. We're going to see huge parts of the healthcare industry, which now generates a large number of American jobs, basically denuded of jobs because you're going to have so many artificial intelligence applications of diagnostic software. We've got to be alert to the fact that over the next several decades, about a third to a half of all the jobs we now have will be displaced. That's not trade, that's technology. And there's not enough political discussion of this. I mean, there are things we can do, not only in terms of lifelong education and job training and making our unemployment system into a reemployment system, but we've got to be serious now about widening and enlarging something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a wage subsidy. We've got to have a serious discussion about public sector jobs. We've got to have a serious discussion about something called the universal basic income, for example. I mean, a lot of things we can do, but to just sit and wait for things to fester and people to get angry and insecure, and then the next demagogue to come along and blame foreigners and blame and just indulge in xenophobia is dangerous.
And listeners, in case you're interested in that particular idea, I'll mention that on tomorrow's show we're going to have one of the Facebook founders, Chris Hughes, who has a new book specifically calling for a guaranteed minimum wage. And we'll talk to him about all kinds of Facebook things too. But that's where Chris Hughes is going politically these days. For former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich here in the Greene Space, let's take another question from the audience. Hi.
Hi, good morning. My question is twofold. The first part is, why is it that income derived from labor is taxed differently than income derived from assets you already have or interest? And the second part of the question is, has anyone ever done anything? Has there ever been a movement to try to equalize that?
We equalized in 1986. The tax reform of 1986 did treat capital gains income and ordinary income exactly the same. It was it was bipartisan and a great success, to the extent that you can say any tax reform is a success. But deeper down, I think that you've got to understand that when it comes to taxes, the game is really dominated by the inside players, by wealthy individuals and corporations who, whenever they get a chance, not surprisingly, will reduce their own taxes. We have we have a labor force now that is increasingly comprised of people that you might call the working poor, people who are working full-time and yet are still poor. That should not be. We shouldn't have anybody who is working full-time and poor. And yet at the same time, at the opposite end of the spectrum, we've got a number of people, a growing number of people, who are non-working rich. That is, they are not retirees. I'm talking about people who are the recipients of vast inheritances that are never taxed. And we are at the cusp of the largest intergenerational transfer of money in history, $30 trillion from very wealthy baby boomers to their lucky millennial heirs, who will, again, never be working. That's not a healthy society. And we can do something about that. I mean, the Republicans have demagogued the estate tax forever, calling it a death tax. I mean, even now, even before the tax law that went into effect January 1st, the estate tax was only hitting a very tiny 0.2% of 1% of the public, and the richest 0.2%. And we ought to revive a discussion about the estate tax. That Abraham Lincoln started the estate tax. We ought to have a discussion about, why is it that once an estate is passed on to heirs, all the capital gains in the assets of that estate are forgiven. Essentially, the basis of that estate, and I don't want to get too technical or in too much in the weeds, goes to the next generation without paying any capital gains at all. I mean, why can't we just have an intelligent, practical discussion about what democracy requires in this country?
Before you go, I'm very concerned about the Dreamers. Their protection from deportation expires on March 5th. That's less than 2 weeks from now. And I fear that Trump will start actually deporting them because he seems willing to do almost anything to keep his base inflamed. So while this isn't exactly in your wheelhouse of economics, after the Senate debate fizzled out last week, what do you see as any potential path forward? Have you thought about this?
Yes, I think that there may be a path forward, but every time I think there's a path forward on the Dreamers, it turns out that it is not a path forward, because you're dealing with a president who keeps on changing his mind and who blocks a lot of the reforms that people, even bipartisan, there have been twice already that there have been bipartisan agreements between Republicans and Democrats in the House or Senate, and he has said, well, I'll go along with it, and then he's changed his mind.
Yep.
So in this kind of atmosphere with this kind of leader, I don't know how we can. But let me just say something, Brian, slightly more general about all of this, because you've got a younger generation now. It's not just Dreamers, and I teach Dreamers, by the way, at the University of California, Berkeley. Some of my best students came over as children to the United States. They've known no country other than the United States. But we also have young people who are starting to say, what is going on here? Many of you might have heard Emma Gonzalez, a very articulate young person in Florida at that tragic scene. She spoke Saturday about young people saying, well, let's be real about guns in schools. We've got a lot of young people that I come across who say...
It's not just let's be real. We played part of her speech on yesterday's show. It's we're calling BS. So she's speaking in that very direct language
we're calling BS,
teenagers coming into political consciousness.
But we're also saying, that is teenagers coming into political consciousness, are also saying, adults, what are you doing? You're supposed to be responsible. What are you doing to us? And so what I see, whether we're talking about the deficit or we're talking about tax reform, we're talking about the erosion of democracy, we're talking about partisanship, we're talking about DACA, we're talking about guns in schools, a lot of young people, whenever I get very depressed, I look to the young people and I say, you guys are really smart. You're committed. You are more engaged than any young generation I've ever seen before. And that's true of my students, and it's true of students I lecture to all over the country. They give me hope for the future.
It's amazing how much hope it seems to me that people are taking right now from those students in Parkland, Florida. It's incredible. I want to ask you, as a last question, one other piece of sort of progressive political history leading to where we are now. because immigration, I had brought up the Dreamers, is another area where progressives concerned about labor have flipped over the years. Labor unions used to be skeptical of large-scale immigration because of the supply and demand pressure on wages. Are unions now positioning themselves against their own interests to align themselves so that they can align themselves with other progressive movements?
Well, the AFL-CIO in recent years has changed its position. It is much more welcoming of immigrants.
Exactly.
And I think that most progressives are starting to understand that they're not just a limited number of jobs to go around. Immigrants do generate more jobs because they earn money and they spend money, and their spending generates more jobs on top of that. And if you look at the history of this country has been generations and generations and more generations of immigrants who have built this country, literally built the country. I mean, the one thing that distinguishes immigrants is actually ambition to get here. Now, this is not all our immigrants. Some were forced here, and some people were here originally. But many immigrants are unique in the sense that they are more ambitious, I think it's fair to say, than native-born people, and they have contributed hugely to this country. And finally, Brian, the only people who have standing to really complain about immigrants are Native Americans.
And on that, we leave it with former Labor Secretary and UC Berkeley Professor Robert Reich. His new book is called The Common Good. And again, if you want to see him in person, he'll be at the Barnes & Noble on the Upper West Side, 2289 Broadway at 82nd, tomorrow night, Wednesday, February 21st at 7 p.m. Secretary Reich, thank you so much for coming to the Greene Space.
Well, thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Brian Lehrer on WNYC will continue in a minute.
Why has WNYC decided to cut the length of our fundraiser and raise all the money in half the time? Because less interruption means more.
I'm Bridget Bergen.
I'm Richard Hake.
I'm Sarah Gonzalez.
I'm Ilya Meritz.
I'm Terry Gross.
WNYC, I'm Arun Venugopal.
Add your voice with a contribution right now and help ensure our All the Money in Half the Time fundraiser is a success. Go to WNYC.org and click on Donate.
WNYC supporters include Adelphi University hosting a grad open house on its Garden City campus Saturday, March 3rd, with details on Adelphi's 80-plus grad programs in business, education, social work, nursing, and more. Adelphi.edu/Garden City. The City of New York, which is offering general obligation bonds to individual investors on Tuesday, February 20th and Wednesday, February 21st. The preliminary official statement and more information are available through financial advisors and broker-dealers. WNYC is a media partner of New York International Children's Film Festival, presenting over 100 new films from around the world for children and teens. This Friday through March 18th. Details at nyicff.org.
WNYC, independent journalism in the public interest. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today. And remember, when we're in the Greene Space, you can watch us as well as listen to us. If you want to see the live video stream of our stage here, you can go to thegreenspace.org. That's green with an E at the end of it. So the Greene E Space, thegreenspace.org, or go to the WNYC Facebook page to catch this live stream. Now, some of you know the new WNYC podcast called Trump Inc., where Andrea Bernstein, Ilya Meritz, and our partners at ProPublica try to solve some of the many mysteries of our president's businesses. And I think we see increasingly that private sector Trump world matters to public sector Trump world, that is, to the fortunes of the American people and our democracy, not just to Trump and his family. For example, CNN is now reporting that Special Counsel Robert Mueller's interest in Jared Kushner has expanded beyond his contacts with Russia and now includes his efforts to secure financing for his company from foreign investors during the presidential transition, according to people familiar with the inquiry. This is the first indication that Mueller is exploring Kushner's discussions with potential non-Russian foreign investors, including China, says CNN. Mueller's investigators have been asking questions, including during interviews in January and February, about Kushner's conversations during the transition to shore up financing for 666 Fifth Avenue, a Kushner Company's backed New York City office building reeling from financial troubles, according to people familiar with the special counsel investigation. And again, that from CNN's original reporting. There's also the reported plea deal that Rick Gates might strike with Mueller any time now. That's an LA Times report. Gates is charged with former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort in tax evasion schemes, but Gates was also with the Trump team much longer than Manafort, right through the transition. So who knows what else might come out as a result of investigations into private business dealings. So those are some tidbits from today's news. The Trump Inc. podcast, in its first few episodes, has looked at how Trump is blurring the line between his presidency and his business interests, lacks money laundering controls at Trump's Taj Mahal casino in Atlantic City. How many of you here in the Greene Space have ever been to Trump's Taj Mahal, Atlantic City? This is not a few. Okay, it's not a gambling crowd, but nevertheless,
the overlap.
Little bit of overlap. So my sources also tell me that a Trump Inc. is soon to come about investments in Russia. And I'll tell everybody they are also looking for tips on Trump businesses that might be newsworthy from you listening to the show today or even here in the Greene Space. And joining me now are WNYC's Andrea Bernstein and Ilya Meritz, as well as Jesse Eisinger from ProPublica, best known these days for his book, whose name I can't say on the radio. We'll call it the Chicken Bleep Club. And no, it's not about what Donald Trump thinks about Haiti and El Salvador. It's about government's reluctance to go after bank executives who helped cause the financial crisis and things like that. But hi, Ilya. Hi, Andrea. Hi, Jesse.
Hi, hey, Brian.
Thanks for having me. Andrea, can I get you on a little of this news first? Mueller looking into Jared Kushner and 666 Fifth Avenue. This seems like something in your wheelhouse. Any clue what he might be looking for?
Well, from the facts on the record, we already know that during the period between the election and the inauguration, Jared Kushner was meeting with bankers around the world. His company, Kushner Companies, which is he was the CEO of, and now it has reverted back to his family. But the company is cash-strapped because they bought a building on Fifth Avenue, 666 Fifth Avenue, which was one of the most expensive office transactions in Manhattan building history at the time. And they have a loan coming due in a couple years, and they don't have a way to pay it. So we know that the Kushner Company has been around the world looking for cash, and specifically we know that during this transition period, Kushner was meeting with a couple of different bankers. At one point he met with a Russian state-owned bank, and the White House said that that meeting was about the transition. The bank said the meeting was about money for Kushner's company. We know that Kushner was also meeting with Chinese bank officials, so there are a lot of questions about whether there was any separation between the president's son-in-law's business and his position as an incoming presidential advisor.
You've reported extensively on Manafort and the way he may have used New York real estate to possibly hide other kinds of deals he's made. I don't know if you want to get into Rick Gates, who's lesser known, but indicted along with Trump, and now he might make this plea, with Manafort, and now might make this plea deal. Don't accuse me of anything, you people. The question, though, is, does any of this lead to any potential crimes by Donald Trump or his family members? CNN says Kushner is not a target of the investigation, and the LA Times story on Rick Gates says Gates may not have anything on Trump, only on Manafort that Mueller is looking for.
We just don't know because the Office of Special Counsel is pretty leak-proof. But what I think is so extraordinary is there's a couple of things we do know. First of all, Rick Gates in the past couple weeks has had a bunch of court appearances regarding changing his lawyers. And people who are experts say that could possibly mean he is looking to make a deal with Mueller's office. There are different strands of the Mueller investigation. So there are the Manafort and Gates indictment, which were for money laundering, allegedly from funds from a Ukrainian strongman through New York real estate. And the other strand is the sort of George Papadopoulos strand, in which there are still some mysteries lingering, that Papadopoulos knew very early on that the Russians had compromising information about Hillary Clinton, that they were going to share it. And there are just some big questions in that indictment about who George Papadopoulos spoke to at the Trump campaign and what he told them, and if any of those people were Manafort or Gates who were working at the campaign at the time. We just don't know, but one big question is, with this Gates maneuvering, are we somehow going to get those two pieces of the puzzle linked together?
Ilya, tell us about the Taj Mahal Casino in Atlantic City. This is your story. It's one of chaotic operations, massive debt, and a tendency to treat rules as more like suggestions. Ring a bell, you say, and you mean ring a bell from how Trump acts as president?
Certainly ring a... The thing that I've been reminded of so many times working on this podcast is Donald Trump spent 50-odd years as a businessman, and he's been president for just over a year. So our thinking is he's really informed by those experiences he had over the decades with his various business projects. The reason we dug in on the Taj Mahal in particular is we thought there was something interesting about that casino that a lot of people didn't know. It wasn't the bankruptcies, although it's been in bankruptcy 4 times. It was the lax anti-money laundering controls. So in February, it might have been March of 2015, right before, 4 months before Donald Trump announces his campaign for president, the Trump Taj Mahal is hit with the largest ever fine by the Treasury Department for poor anti-money laundering controls. And if you read the document, it's written in this bureaucratic language, but it's full of it suggests like a certain amount of like anger and incredulity on the part of the inspectors, just all the many ways in which they should have been recording details of transactions and weren't recording those transactions, and how it happened over an extended period of time. They'd been checking periodically over a 12-year span. So that really intrigued me. It seemed like something that hadn't gotten probably the play that it deserved. And when we looked into it further, what we found out is not only were there poor anti-money laundering controls at the Trump Taj Mahal in that time frame, but the New Jersey Attorney General actually brought cases and got convictions and sent people to jail for laundering money at that hotel in that time frame.
What kind of money would get laundered through an Atlantic City casino? Why is that the vehicle for what?
Well, any kind of money that's dirty, whether it's from drugs or extortion or prostitution or some illicit activity, is money that you might want to launder. A casino is a great place to do it because there's huge volumes of cash moving around all the time. It's easier to claim that you might have won that money. And a casino that is known for looking the other way, when you bring in a large volume of cash and then bring that cash out, might be a favored destination. I should just add, Donald Trump has never been tied specifically to money laundering at the Trump Taj Mahal, but there are so many accused and suspected money launderers in his orbit. We were just talking about Paul Manafort and Rick Gates. That's one of the crimes they're accused of.
So is there any implication here for public policy, or is this just, oh, look at the kind of scene that Donald Trump used to preside over?
I think there's a little bit more to it than that. It's not just, oh, look at the shady business this guy was involved in. It's really when you look at the span of how that casino operated over 27-odd years, it was actually hit with a huge fine for poor anti-money laundering controls right at the beginning in 1991 or 1992 as well, when they were in there inspecting. And so what it says is this is someone with a different regard for the law from what we might expect. Someone who didn't see an upside in cooperating with investigators or listening closely to what they had to say.
I think the other thing that's really important in this project, Trump Inc., we're trying to understand what is happening with the president's businesses now. And the Taj Mahal was a spectacularly deeply investigated and well-documented account of a business associated with the president. So one of the things that we've been looking at is for signposts, for a roadmap ahead. How can we understand what he's doing now? Well, here's one case of his business practices. What are the common themes that we should be looking for as we move forward?
And we do have Andrea Bernstein, Ilya Meritz, and Jesse Eisinger from the new WNYC and ProPublica podcast, Trump Inc. If anybody here in the Greene Space has a question for them, raise your hands. Listeners, we can take a question or two on the phones, 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Jesse, I gather you're working on this forthcoming Russia piece. What can you tell us as a preview without scooping yourself?
Sure. Well, as Andrea and Ilya have been very diplomatic, but the point of the Trump Inc. podcast is that not only does he have this 50-year business record, but the business record is one of repeated catastrophic failures, bankruptcies, accusations of fraud, investigations. It was a shambolic organization, rife with incompetence and things that skirted the edge of the law. What you have to understand about the central notion of the biggest scandal in the presidency today, which is the Russia investigation, is that it's inseparable from understanding his businesses. You need to understand the arc of the Trump organization and Donald Trump's businesses to understand what the connection or potential connections with Russia are, and then that takes you to a question of whether there were nefarious connections, whether there were connections that ran Trump into problems, whether the Russians have something on Trump, and then therefore whether Trump is donating a pro for the quid. Or I don't know if I had that expression.
Or a quid for the quo, or
quo for the quid,
for
yes.
something. The Washington Post reported last year, quote, "The simple truth is that Trump has been hungry for Russia projects for more than 3 decades. He has repeatedly touted plans for a Moscow megadevelopment and has courted a steady stream of investors from the former Soviet Union for ventures in New York, South Florida, and other locations. Trump has enjoyed playing the big guy in Moscow, as he bragged to a New York real estate publication after a November 2013 dinner with prominent business leaders. The Russian market is attracted to me." He thinks everyone's attracted. If that's true, Jesse, what's the Russian market to begin with? What does Trump even mean by that?
Well, this is what, our episode, the next episode, is going to be discussing Glenn Simpson's testimony. Glenn Simpson ran an investigative operation for hire called Fusion GPS, and they investigated Trump's businesses, first for Republicans, then for Democrats.
Paid for the so-called Steele dossier.
Right. And what we don't look at the Steele dossier in the episode, because what he spent most of his time on, and what is more important, is the business arc. And so what Simpson's theory is, and he starts with a mystery, this guy keeps going to Russia and coming back with nothing. He doesn't build a hotel in Russia.
A lot of talks.
There's a lot of talk. So is he incompetent? Is he failing to strike a deal each time he goes to Russia? Well, with Trump, you can never eliminate the possibility that he's utterly incompetent. But Glenn comes to realize or believe that there's something more, that he is actually succeeding in these businesses, these trips. And what he's succeeding in is, well, you'll have to listen to the podcast.
That is the
what a tease.
Central mystery of this episode. Right. I should also add that in it, we spoke to a man who worked very closely with Trump at the Trump Organization, in charge of getting financing for 12 years. So we're sort of looking at the theories of alternative financing.
So without doing any spoilers, we got through our whole segment on Black Panther yesterday without spoiling the ending. We can get through this one on our own podcast. But one place where this traces back potentially to the election and the Mueller investigation, and you touched on it, is these nagging questions of whether Russia has something on Donald Trump. Even after the 13 indictments of Russians on Friday and Trump's kind of grudging and tacit acknowledgement that they meddled at all, he's still not criticizing Russia or Putin or vowing to take any action or even sign a sanctions bill that the Senate's already passed with 97 votes. Remember, Michael Flynn had to resign as National Security Advisor because the Justice Department concluded he was blackmailable by Russia. So how close can any of you come with what you've been looking into here to saying what, if anything, Russia might have on Trump? Jesse?
I mean, it's unsatisfying. We don't know. What we do know is that Trump's behavior is inexplicable. This is a guy who's blustering around the world, challenging everyone, except that he's docile, like a labradoodle in front of Putin. Why? There's a great mystery. And so he also has these seeming ties to Russian investors, Russian money, which we walk through in the podcast through Glenn's research, but not just Glenn's, but many other people's research. So it leads you to this central question. Unfortunately, we don't know. Now, Mueller is doing what a very competent special counsel or prosecutorial investigation is doing. He's flipping. So you need to flip the lower level people. This is the way you do it in a mob prosecution. You flip the soldiers to get to the capo, to get to the capo di tutti capi. This is the way he's working up. Now,
that was very good. Did you practice saying that fast?
I've been giving. Did I mention that I have a book? Yes, I can shill for it.
I think it is really important to say, though, that the enterprise of this podcast is trying to figure things out. So we are quite clear that we don't have all the answers, and we're hoping that with each episode and everybody's tips that they're sending us, and people are sending us a lot, so thank you, that we're going to get closer to figuring this out. So that is the project.
Let's take a question from an audience member here in the Greene Space. Hello.
Hello. You mentioned the history of the Taj Mahal regarding the lax money controls. But did you think that Trump felt politically protected then? Because he was a Democrat before he became a Republican. For him to, to be so lax and declare bankruptcy so many times. I mean, where were the politicians then? Were they busy taking contributions from Trump?
Ilya.
Well, one of the interesting things we heard from a New Jersey state regulator is that in the 90s, after the first bankruptcy, the Trump Taj Mahal went into bankruptcy less than 2 years after it launched as the biggest casino ever, and it went into bankruptcy. But Donald Trump at that point owned 3 casinos in Atlantic City, which was the legal limit, and regulators viewed him as too big to fail. So if he were to lose his gaming license, thousands of people potentially could be out of work. It would be a catastrophe, not just for Atlantic City, but really for New Jersey. So that I thought was a very interesting way of looking at the position that he put himself in there in terms of being close to politicians or people going easy on him. That may have played a role. I've read various things over the years. I wanted to keep this to the documented history of poor anti-money laundering controls. And it's interesting. I mean, we think of casinos as being this sort of over there kind of category of business, like a little bit sort of outside of the mainstream. They're financial institutions. They are regulated by the Treasury Department like any other financial institution, and the same laws apply, slightly differently, but basically the same laws apply of know your customer, know the source of funds. So disregarding that is a pretty serious dereliction of duty.
And Jesse's book would probably tell us that the same laws of gambling generally apply.
Exactly.
Let's go to a phone call. Yair in Brooklyn. You're on WNYC. Hello.
To relate to the Taj Mahal, during the election, we heard that we got a little tidbit of Trump's tax return. We saw that he claimed close to $1 billion of losses on the Taj Mahal. As I understand it, those losses were actually incurred by the bondholders who lent him the money. How can you have two parties claiming the same losses for the purposes of taxes? I thought that's prima facie not possible. Either the bondholder lost $1 billion and claims that for their losses, or Trump. How can both do it?
Ilya's getting all the love from the audience questions today.
I'm sorry to say I don't have an answer for that question. I do remember that news breaking at the time as well. Jesse may know something more than I do.
I was afraid it was going to be pitched to me. It was a weird quirk in the tax law that we're going to have another guest for. I'm going to throw it to someone else, but I can't remember exactly why. But it was a legal maneuver, a legal loophole.
Another question here in the Greene Space. Hello.
Oh, thank you. I'm very impressed with the work that you're doing. One of the things that I was wondering, I have two questions really, is now that you're looking at this whole dense thing in such detail, I find it remarkable that there was less scrutiny during the campaign. And, you know, there was this discussion of a perfect storm of social factors that got Trump elected. But one would have thought that these news outlets would have been so much more attentive to the density and sort of the nefarious quality of all of his business dealings. And then the specific question is, the Deutsche Bank connection really intrigues me, and I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. Thanks very much for what you're doing.
Thank you for your question. Who wants that? Jesse?
Sure. I can take it quickly, which is that I think there was actually a lot of good reporting about Trump's business record, particularly by the Washington Post, but others, the New York Times did some. But there was so much there. One of our colleagues likens this to a DDoS attack on our psyches, like the overloading of the website by hackers. Well, we're being overloaded by subjects and targets for investigation from Trump. There was no one scandal because there were so many. It was so overwhelming. So it was much easier to understand the Hillary Clinton email scandal, which I think was a scandal, but a very minor one. And then you had this enormity of the business relationships that kind of diffused the attention. So I don't think that there was enough attention paid, but I also do think there was good reporting, and it just kind of got washed out.
I also think that some of these things were so outside of our experience that, I covered the campaign and to find, I remember the exact moment when the Hillary Clinton campaign issued a press release saying the email hacks was orchestrated by the Russians. And I was like, what? That is the weirdest thing I've ever seen in a campaign. And I had the experience during the convention of, talking to people and talking actually throughout the years to a lot of, especially young voters who were very alienated from the Hillary Clinton campaign. And we know now, as of Friday, that was a well-financed, well-orchestrated Russian endeavor, was to try to stir up those feelings. So I think that, in answer to your question, things were happening that we had never experienced before, and we had no basis to process them. So, but I agree with Jesse. The Washington Post put out a book in August of 2016 about Trump's businesses. So some of this stuff, not all of it, but some of this stuff has begun to be out there, or had begun to be out there at that time.
We are just about out of time with our three guests from the new WNYC and ProPublica podcast, Trump Inc. Ilya, you want to just get a last word and tell people how they can submit tips, because you are asking for tips that relate to Trump businesses in particular from the audience, right?
Yeah, you can go on over to trumpincpodcast.org. You'll find a phone number if you want to leave a message. You'll find an email if you want to send us an email. You can also send us documents on Signal or WhatsApp, so encrypted communication if you want to share stuff with us, photographs. We got tips from somebody in India of this strange infomercial-like story about the Trump Towers India, which we played in our first episode. This was before some of the reporting that you heard over the weekend about Donald Trump's Jr.'s project right now. So thank you if you've already tipped us. If you haven't yet and you have something to share, go to trumpincpodcast.org. We really are reading every tip.
And of course, listeners, you can subscribe to Trump Inc. To listen to wherever you get your podcast. We thank WNYC's Ilya Meritz and Andrea Bernstein and Jesse Eisinger from ProPublica. Jesse's current book is also out called The Chicken Bleep Club. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
This is WNYC FM, HD, and AM New York, WNJT FM, 88.1 Trenton, WNJP, 88.5 Sussex, WNJY, 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO, 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio. The Brian Lehrer Show live in the Greene Space today, and for many of you here in the audience, those of you who have not come to a previous Brian Lehrer Show live in the Greene Space, this will be the first rendering of the latest news that you've ever seen from a theater stage with Richard Hake.
Hi, Brian. 100 Stoneman Douglas High School students are traveling 400 miles by bus to Florida's capital today to urge state lawmakers to act to prevent a repeat of the massacre that killed 17 students and faculty last week. The students plan to hold a rally tomorrow in Tallahassee in the hopes that'll put pressure on the state's Republican-controlled legislature to consider a sweeping package of gun control laws, something some GOP lawmakers down there said yesterday they would consider. In this area, a New Jersey school district is adding armed police officers to its security. The East Brunswick School Board decided the officers will supplement its existing staff of 71 security guards who are all retired police officers. Governor Phil Murphy plans to hold a news conference about this later today. Special counsel Robert Mueller's prosecutors have filed a new charge against a lawyer they say lied to federal investigators in the Russia probe. A charging document filed in federal court in Washington this morning accuses Alex van der Zwaan of one charge of making a false statement. The information was filed ahead of a plea hearing that's scheduled for later today. The court filing says that van der Zwaan lied to investigators about his interactions with Rick Gates, a former Trump campaign aide. And a new report finds the Hudson River contains a stew of dissolved pharmaceuticals. WNYC's Jim O'Grady explains researchers track the chemicals from Albany all the way to New York City.
Columbia University biologist Andrew Jewell led the study of water samples from 72 spots. He found trace amounts of everything from antibiotics to blood pressure drugs. Jewell believes the contaminants probably don't pose a direct threat to people who swim, catch fish, or even get their drinking water from the Hudson. But it's bad news if you're a fish.
There's a difference between drinking treated drinking water and, living your life marinated in a soup of pharmaceuticals, and that's what the aquatic organisms are facing.
Jewell says pharmaceuticals float far and wide and are found throughout the estuary. That makes them different from concentrations of harmful PCBs and bacteria released by sewage treatment plants.
Speaking of germs, you've heard the news. It's a terrible flu season, and for some, it's bringing fears of being in places where you're crowded with other people. No, we're talking the subway. But there may be more cause of optimism. Dr. Christopher Mason is a geneticist and associate professor at Weill Cornell Medical Center. And back in 2013, he and his team swabbed a bunch of stations and trains and platforms and seats and poles and studied some of the germs in the subway.
Most of the surfaces you touch on the subway are really perfectly safe and harmless on most days.
Yeah, most days. He says the high relative humidity in the subway that's common is working in your favor because the water vapor prevents the germs from traveling far. At the same time, he says get your flu shot and wash your hands. I would still avoid touching the pole. Still some fog in the tri-state area. Expect clouds for the remainder of the day. It'll be mild with a high around 64 degrees. Chance of some more light rain tonight. And tomorrow, light rain and fog in the morning, but clearing skies by the afternoon, and it will feel like spring, maybe a little bit like summer. Highs near 70 degrees. That's the latest from the WNYC Newsroom and the Greene Space. I'm Richard Hake.
February is Black History Month, and WNYC is celebrating with a range of programs, including Shackled Legacy, which explores American colleges and universities and their ties to the slave trade. Plus, a look at Black America since Martin Luther King Jr., hosted by Henry Louis Gates Jr. Tune in all this week at 9 p.m. on 93.9 FM and find all our Black History Month specials at wnyc.org/Black History Month.
Support for WNYC comes from the John Theurer Cancer Center at Hackensack University Medical Center, part of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Hackensack Meridian Health Partnership. More at jtcancercenter.org. City National Bank, working to help businesses, entrepreneurs, and their families for over 60 years. City National Bank, the way up. Learn more at cnb.com. Ascend Public Charter Schools in Central Brooklyn, where each teacher's mission is to lead students on an intellectual adventure and prepare them for success in college and beyond. Information about career opportunities at ascendlearning.org. Support for the Greene Space, WNYC street-level state-of-the-art events venue and broadcast studio at 44 Charlton Street, is provided by the Jerome L. Greene Foundation.
To cut our upcoming fundraiser in half and still raise the same amount of money, WNYC relies on a secret. Here's a hint. Take out your phone, take a selfie, and look at it. Yeah, WNYC relies on you.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC, live from the Greene Space today. And as usual, when we're in the Greene Space, you can watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen to it. So if you want to watch the live video stream that our Greene Space technology allows us to put out, you can go to thegreenspace.org. Remember, Green has an E at the end of it, that word, so thegreenspace.org. Or you can go to the WNYC Facebook page and find the live stream there. Now, the art world began its reckoning of centuries of gender imbalance with this rallying cry: abuse of power comes as no surprise. That phrase is borrowed from conceptual artist Jenny Holzer's truisms, and in October of last year, right on the heels of the MeToo movement's beginning, over 2,000 women and gender nonconforming artists, writers, curators, and gallerists signed an open letter, not surprised, calling out the power structures that allow sexual misconduct in the art world. Now, it's not surprising that powerful men would abuse their power in art as in any other field, but here's the hard part the art world is grappling with, maybe uniquely: what to do with works of art that represent problematic imagery or are created by problematic artists who have abused their positions or abuse women in their personal lives. Joining me now to discuss the MeToo movement and how women's stories are impacting the art world is Priscilla Frank, arts and culture reporter for the Huffington Post. She broke the recent story about the artist Chuck Close. Priscilla, thanks so much for coming to the Greene Space. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you for having me.
And let's begin with, I guess, the initial question suggested by the No Surprise as the title of the movement. Does anything about the art world in particular make it any more or less surprising that powerful men would abuse their power?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why the art world is unique. One is that so many of the interactions take place not in traditional office settings, but behind closed doors, whether it's an artist and his subject in a studio, or a collector and an artist, or a lot of socializing takes place, a lot of networking. Additionally, the nude female body is one of the oldest subjects in art, and one of the first things that you learn in art school is how to draw a figure. Often that is a naked woman. So there's this sense that since the dawn of art history, women's bodies have been objectified and are seen. There's just a time-honored tradition of seeing men as the geniuses and the creators and the subjects, and women as the objects. And
you broke the story about sexual misconduct allegations against the artist Chuck Close. Some New Yorkers not familiar with Close may not know his 12 mosaics recently installed at the 86th Street station on the new 2nd Avenue subway line. Close also painted Bill Clinton's presidential portrait by way of historical reference. Why don't you take us through the allegations in your story?
Yeah, so basically I spoke to one woman and she told me her story, and then eventually it came out that this seemed to be a pattern that other women had experienced. She met Chuck Close at an art event. He came up to her, offered to make a portrait of her, and she was an aspiring artist, and he's obviously one of the most influential and powerful portrait artists alive today. It was a huge honor. Many of his most well-known portraits are paintings that are sort of pixelated and hyper-realistic, zoomed in on people's faces. So she assumed, like many of these other women, this was the kind of portrait that he would be doing. Often he paints artists that he admires, so she was very flattered and excited. They emailed, she went to his studio. Once she got there, he told her to get naked, and it was going to be a nude portrait, and in fact that this was more of an audition to even see if she would end up being chosen for a portrait. oftentimes these women were uncomfortable, didn't expect to get naked, and some left. Some ended up being coerced into taking off their clothes. He then acted inappropriately. One woman, he made lewd comments about her vagina. One woman, he asked to touch her vagina. One woman, he asked if she would masturbate for him. So a lot of these women left feeling deceived and humiliated, and like he had used his position of power as an artist to take advantage of them.
So before we even get to the question of what to do with his art, where it's currently displayed, I mean, these allegations that you just described highlight the lack of protections for models, especially since you said, as you said before, a lot of these interactions take place behind closed doors, obviously. Is there any kind of industry protocol as to how art models should expect to be treated and how they should expect to be able to protect themselves?
Yes, there are modeling unions that I think work more in the fashion industry, and in the art world, a lot of people who are professional sitters for life drawing classes. One woman who I spoke with was, so she told me how different this felt from the protocol that she was normally forced to follow, where one thing she mentioned was she always went to the bathroom to change and then came back in a robe, so you didn't have to just deal with that vulnerability of getting naked in front of somebody. Also, you would never be asked to pose nude on the spot. You would always know about that beforehand. But in the case of Close, a lot of people that he was asking were artists or just women that he met at parties, so they were not professional models.
We can talk about artists who've exhibited problematic behavior. We can also talk about works of art in which the subject is problematic. On November 30th of last year, New Yorkers Mia Merrill and Anna Zuccaro put together a petition on Care 2 demanding that the Met either remove or amend the wall text to a painting by French artist Balthus titled Thérèse Dreaming. Can you briefly describe that painting for our audience?
Yeah, so it is a sort of surrealist painting of a girl, Thérèse, which is based off of Balthus, the artist's neighbor, who was 12 years old at the time. She's leaning back in a chair, her legs are spread, her eyes are closed, her underwear is showing. It's definitely unsettling, erotic, and it's a challenging image of a 12-year-old girl.
And joining us now is Anna Zuccaro, one of the co-authors of the petition. Anna, thank you for giving us some time on the phone. Welcome to WNYC.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me.
So tell us why you found the painting to be problematic, or I guess we just heard a suggestion of it from Priscilla, but you can go more into it if you want, and what inspired you to call on the Met to actually remove it?
Right. That's a great question. So my sister and I found the Balthus painting problematic because of its obviously undeniably erotic portrayal of a 12-year-old girl, but also because the Met really provides zero context when it comes to the history of Balthus and his history of sexual abuse. So upon further research, we found out that Balthus was not a newcomer to controversy or criticism when it came to his relationship with young girls. And throughout the entirety of his career, his paintings and a lot of these perverse relationships caused stirs throughout the art world. So given all of that, what inspired us to act was the attention surrounding a lot of the MeToo movement, and we felt empowered to start the petition asking the Met to reconsider the way it presents Thérèse Dreaming after realizing the concept of sexual abuse was not exempt from fine art.
So a spokesman for the Met responded to your petition by writing this, quote, "Moments such as this provide an opportunity for conversation, and visual art is one of the most significant means we have for reflecting on both the past and the present and encouraging the continuing evolution of existing culture through informed discussion and respect for creative expression," unquote. And I should say the Met has not taken any action to remove the piece or amend the wall text. I'm guessing you're not satisfied with the museum's response, but how would you respond to the words in that paragraph?
Well, I mean, first, just to be clear, Mia and I didn't really want, nor did we expect the Met to actually remove the painting. We use the word remove in the title of the petition more as a tactic to raise attention surrounding the issue that Balthus was a sexual abuser, which is reflected in much of his work, including Thérèse Dreaming, of course. But in regard to the Met's official response, Mia and I actually agree that moments like these really do provide opportunities to discuss larger issues. And in this case, this is education and the implications of art on society. But yeah, we were definitely less than satisfied by the Met's refusal to amend the wall text. We really do love the Met as an institution and understand that change at a place like the Met takes time, but we felt their response skirted the main issue a bit and used some basic talking points in general language to do so.
It was very general language. Let me try to put some of it into what seems to me the plain English that they were trying to get at here. When they write, moments such as this provide an opportunity for conversation, and visual art is one of the most significant means we have for reflecting on both the past and the present, and encouraging the continuing evolution of existing culture through informed discussion. I guess it means now we can have this conversation that looks back and says, God, that was really inappropriate, and that there's usefulness just in that, in doing that expressively, without taking the work of art down. So is your bigger issue that you would have liked some text drawing attention to the issues that you raised?
Absolutely, and I think and Priscilla made a really good point in her article. That mentions the petition. She says that people that like Shelley Ball, who's an artist and curator and educator, really are concerned more with addressing the way that art is discussed and taught, as opposed to the way it's just displayed. So I think that ties into a lot of what the Met was trying to say in their initial response.
Priscilla, you want to get in on this? What are you thinking as you listen to Anna and she just referenced your article?
Yeah, so I saw the petition, and afterwards I reached out to some museum educators to hear their thoughts. I think a lot of people did react immediately and viscerally to the idea of removing the painting, and there was a lot of backlash against the petition, and really the idea of amending the wall text and creating some context got overlooked. So I spoke to museum educators who saw this as an opportunity for change. Art like this is weird because it was made so long ago, and yet we experience it and live it in the present. So it is this opportunity to see how we've evolved and how people saw teenage girls at that time. So I spoke with one museum educator who was talking about a student-curated show at her institution, the Clark Museum, that was called Romance and Rape Culture, where they highlighted works from their permanent collection that had perhaps troubling gender dynamics, or she mentioned one sculpture of Bacchus and Ariadne, where Bacchus is waking up Ariadne by kissing her while she's sleeping. And in curating the show, these students were just asking questions like, is it okay to kiss a woman who's sleeping without her consent? And using
Al Franken only does that for comic effect. I mean, just throw that.
Yeah, using these images as the living organisms that they are, and using them to have conversations. And I do think that art is a huge part, obviously, of a museum experience, but so are the didactic materials that surround it. And I do think it would be exciting for museums to see this as an opportunity to activate the problematic pieces in their collection.
So, Anna, let me get your reaction before you go, and then we're going to open this up for audience members here in the Greene Space and listeners who want to call in to sort of the more global question that this raises. Jerry Saltz, the New York Magazine art critic, after seeing your petition, wrote this on Instagram. If you take Terrace Dreaming out, you pretty much have to remove all art from Wings of India, Africa, Asia, Oceania, Greece, Rome, Renaissance, Rococo, and Impressionism, German Expressionism, Klimt, Munch, and all Picasso and Matisse. Hashtag Art World Taliban. Whoa. So we have at least one person applauding here in the Greene Space. And we'll see how many other people want to applaud when given the opportunity in a minute. But obviously, it goes way beyond this one Balthus piece. So, what would you say about the general project, if there should be a general project, of going through all of art from all of art history that's displayed publicly and deciding what's acceptable by today's standards?
Right. Well, firstly, the fact that Jerry felt compelled to comment on my sister and my petition was really cool. So we kind of nerded out for a second about that. And I think that he brings up an interesting idea, though it is a bit tongue-in-cheek, that, recontextualizing art that portrays sexual abuse, however it is displayed, is actually a pretty novel and interesting concept. I don't know how long something like that would take, but I think it could be worth undertaking. I think it could be worth looking into art history and looking into how we educate others and trying to describe or at least encapsulate what's going on in some of these images.
Ana Zuccaro, co-author of that recent petition on Care 2, demanding that the Met either remove or amend the wall text to that painting by the French artist Balthus titled "To Race Dreaming." Thanks so much for coming on and explaining where you're at.
Thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate it.
Now we're going to take a break here in the Greene Space. Then we're going to come back and have a little bit of that more global conversation. So people here in the Greene Space, get ready to speak up or ask a question. And listeners, we can take a few phone calls on this at 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692, whether it's exploitation of a 12-year-old from how many years ago or whatever else it is, or the behavior of the artist. Will bring up the case that always gets referenced of, well, what do you do about Picasso? 212-433-9692 as we continue with Priscilla Frank from Huffington Post, who wrote about this issue. Stay with us.
Growing up in rural Idaho, Tara Westover didn't go to school, had no birth certificate, and never saw a doctor, while her family stowed food and weapons for a confrontation with the government. On the next Fresh Air, she talks about growing up, getting a PhD, and coming to terms with her background. Tara Westover's memoir is Educated. Join us.
Today at 2 on 93.9 FM WNYC.
WNYC is supported by Flatiron Books, publishers of Force of Nature. In Jane Harper's new novel, 5 women go out into the woods for a hike, but only 4 return. Force of Nature, available now. Montclair Film, presenting 70s Mixtape, a dance party with performances by Stephen Colbert, John Batiste, Patrick Wilson, Warren Zanes, and Joe McGinty in the Losers Lounge. Saturday, February 24th at 8 p.m., montclairfilm.org.
Who's behind that Twitter account? A person or a bot?
There's kind of the Bernie bots or the resist bots, and on the other side there's kind of the alt-right, far-right group.
The war of the social media bots and what it's doing to American politics. It's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today. And when you're live in the Greene Space, when we're live in the Greene Space, you can watch us on live streaming video if you choose at thegreenspace.org, green with an E at the end of it, thegreenspace.org, or on our Facebook page, the WNYC Facebook page. You can watch the show as well as listen to it today. My current guest is Priscilla Frank, arts and culture reporter for the Huffington Post. She broke the recent story about the artist Chuck Close and the allegations of sexual misconduct pertaining to him and particularly some of his models. So audience members in the Greene Space, listeners out there in Radio Land, how many of you, we heard the one audience member applauding spontaneously, how many of you would give, let's say, a full 3 cheers, applaud if you would, to what New York Magazine art critic Jerry Saltz wrote on Instagram about that particular petition regarding the Balthus at the Met? If you take today's streaming out, you pretty much have to remove all art from wings of India, Africa, Asia, Oceania, Greece, Rome, Renaissance, Rococo, and Impressionism, German Expressionism, Klimt, Munch, and all Picasso and Matisse. Hashtag Art World Taliban. 3 cheers, applause if you're a 3 cheers person. How about if you're a 2 cheers person? Like you think he raises a really important issue here, but you don't want to dismiss the movement in the way he did. And 0 to 1 cheers like, oh, please, come on, stop being so retrograde. We have to look these things in the eye. Okay. All right, so we have found the issue that divides the Brian Lehrer Show Greene Space audience. And I understand that the gentleman who originally applauded here in the audience will follow up with a comment. Sir, thank you very much.
Thank you. I just feel like the MeToo movement has created a bit of a reign of terror in this country, to the point that I find myself rolling my eyes and not listening to what may very well be legitimate concerns. And now I'm hearing that we want to empty our museums for the same purpose. And what I feel is happening, and I consider myself to be a very progressive male, but what is happening is that this is all sort of just going into the ether, and legitimate concerns aren't being heard because, again, I feel it's a reign of terror, and all of a sudden it's affected the art world. It certainly has already affected, film and television. Now it's affecting our museums, and I'm not saying that it's not without merits on some level, but I feel like we need to look at this on without being so reactionary to every single thing and to dismiss everything.
Reign of terror makes it sound unfounded. So when you hear about...
Well, I would argue, Brian, that during the French Revolution, there were people who very well felt they had grounded ideals, right? But there was a reign of terror that was trying to eliminate anything that people felt disagreeable with.
So would you point to any particular example of injustice as opposed to just a feeling that you have about it?
I feel like what we're hearing, and it's happened at this radio station as well, people are disappearing, right, because of allegations. But I'm not hearing the reasons why, right? All we hear is, oh, no, they're gone, right? There was an investigation and they're gone. But I don't know why they're gone, right? People are disappearing. People are leaving. And if someone has a legitimate concern, then they should be bringing that to the fore. And I do take a little bit of exception with, well, people are afraid because there are people who are so powerful. Like, I'm sorry, I think some people are hiding behind that. I think there's some truth to it, but I think a lot of people are hiding behind that. And I think you have to take a position, and you have to stand up, and you have to accuse people and deal with the consequences of that.
Right, and I certainly, because you referenced our own case, I feel like I should say that I've also spoken about how I wish that we could be told more. There have been any number of cases in the Me Too movement era where confidentiality and transparency seem to come into conflict with each other. I would really like to see some way for people's confidentiality to be protected while still, when we're talking about public figures, if there's anything there that has really warranted the actions, for them to be made as public as possibly could be. But who wants to respond to that gentleman with maybe a different point of view? And anybody? So, okay, we have somebody over there. Hi.
I'm going to stand for this one. Brian, you gave a lot of platform to this gentleman over here.
Your turn.
As someone who has experienced assault and harassment my entire life, as someone who knows hundreds and thousands of women who have, this is really not the time for you to be defensive or to get the kind of platform you just got. Priscilla, I want to thank you. You actually did a wonderful story on my colleague Jayshree Abichandani's protest outside the Met Brewer. Jayshree is a South Asian artist who alleges that she was raped when she was an assistant to a very well-known photographer, Raghuveer Singh, overseas. The reason I want to bring it up, I had no idea you were going to be on today, is because women of color are often sidelined in this conversation, and I'm really grateful that you gave Jayshree's protest a voice. You can Google Jayshree Abichandani. One thing I am curious about is why aren't we giving more attention to the fact that women artists struggle so much to have their work shown at museums and organizations like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I'm not so much interested in getting rid of the Picasso art of the world as it is making space for women who are just as talented as those Picassos of the world to have their art shown. It is absolutely brutal that we're not making space for these women, right? And that's true in every single industry out there. And I'm so glad you're highlighting the artistic world. It's something very few of us know about. I stopped watching Woody Allen movies about 3 or 4 years ago after I saw Dylan's piece in the New York Times. She's such a credible woman. That's why I believed her. When I saw Woody's reaction to that piece, I didn't like how he treated his daughter. That's why I believe Dylan Farrow. My life has not significantly changed by not watching Woody Allen movies, which I grew up with since the time I was 5 years old. I am still a happy moviegoer. My life has not been ruined by boycotting Woody Allen's movies. I think the same can be said for any artist out there. Thank you.
Do you want to go any further with respect to the art that is in museums that's either objectionable in, what it depicts or the way it was made or the other behavior of the artist, in addition to making more room for women artists?
I think the petition is a brilliant idea. I would love to see context for, I'm not a dumb museum goer. I would like to know where these pieces came from. I think any 12-year-old child who is exposed like that, I have an immediate reaction. I not only, I would like to know the context, and then I would like that painting taken down. But that's because I don't think that child sexual abuse is something that we should be supporting in the United States of America.
Thank you very much. Priscilla, what are you thinking?
Well, first of all...
You don't have to be the final arbiter of all of these points of view.
I wanted to stress that I am not arguing that we clear out museums, and I don't really think that anybody is. I do think the things that I've heard loudly are, number one, more context, so these images aren't presented in a vacuum where they can be disturbing/influencing viewers, and also to diversify collections. Art history is a history of power, and the voices that we've heard have overwhelmingly been not only white and male, but misogynist. And I think that this isn't only the job of artists, but of teachers and curators and institutions to decide what kind of stories they want to tell. And it's fine to show this perspective because it's a very real and prominent perspective, but I think we should then really be trying to provide more visions of womanhood and sexuality and personhood.
And I want to just bring one other thing into it before we run out of time. You spent a lot of time talking to educators about what to do with works of art that not only the things we've been talking about how the subjects of the art are treated or depicted, but also that feature content that's no longer, that's kind of racist, frankly. Artists from the 19th century like Jean-Léon Gérôme and Eugène Delacroix, their work today could be described as Orientalist, meaning their paintings portrayed Eastern cultures as inferior and strange. And I wonder how you think that topic intersects with the MeToo discussion about the treatment of women.
Yes, someone brought this up to me when I was doing these interviews and said that she saw how we see Orientalism as a movement today was a potential thing to look forward to, a goal for the Me Too movement. Now, when we look at how these Western painters painted people from the East as exotic and other, we don't see that as a truthful depiction. We see that as a representation of how Westerners imagined the other and imagined Easterners. And so I think that there's room for us to see these many depictions of passive, sexual, beautiful women and not think, oh, this is what women's sexuality is, but, oh, this is how men imagined women's sexuality for so long.
We are going to have to leave it here because we are out of time for this segment. Obviously, this is a conversation that's going on in the art world, in the media world, in many other worlds. And we thank Priscilla Frank, arts and culture reporter for the Huffington Post, who broke the recent story about artist Chuck Close. First, for your reporting, and second, for coming here to the Greene Space and talking about it with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, and we'll come back with Brittany Cooper from Rutgers Crunk Feminist Collective. Stay with us.
Headlines on your phone barely break the surface. Dive into the news.
The heating crisis in New York City public housing was partly due to a lack of staff to fix its unreliable boilers. As temperatures plummeted last month, the situation got so bad that the city pulled in personnel from other departments.
Listen to Morning Edition every day on WNYC.
WNYC supporters include William Patterson University, presenting their Distinguished Lecturer Series featuring Chef Alice Waters with a Q&A and book signing Friday, March 2nd, 7:30 p.m. at the Shea Center for Performing Arts in Wayne, New Jersey. Tickets at wppresents.org. Virgin Atlantic, with nonstop flights from New York to London daily. More info at virginatlantic.com. Virgin Atlantic, let it fly. WNYC is a media partner for the New York Moth Story Slam, a storytelling competition featuring stories on the theme of transit. Thursday, February 22nd at Housing Works. Info at themoth.org.
Less is more. WNYC is cutting our pledge drive in half. Less interruption, more news and reporting. But we still need to raise the same amount of money. Your donation now at WNYC.org will make it possible.
Okay, ladies, now let's get information. Okay, ladies, now let's get information. Prove to me you got some coordination. Slave trick, are you getting eliminated?
And while Beyonce probably doesn't need an academic to defend her star power, her feminism might be another matter. But Brittany Cooper, an associate professor of women's and gender studies and Africana studies at Rutgers, co-founder of the Crunk Feminist Collective, her Twitter handle is @ProfessorCrunk, who is also a Cosmopolitan magazine columnist, is happy to do so. It's just one of many things in her new book of essays called Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower, and it is out today. Congratulations on the book, and welcome back to WNYC, but welcome to the Greene Space.
Thank you, Brian.
And we'll come back to Beyonce eventually, but I see the term eloquent rage came from a former student, and at first you didn't like it. Would you tell us the story?
Yes. So I was a graduate student instructor many years ago, and one of my students, Erica, and I happened a few months after she was out of my class to be talking, and she said, "I love to hear you lecture," because it was like the most eloquent rage ever. And I felt some type of way about it because, you know, black women get saddled with that angry black woman stereotype. And I said, I wasn't angry, I'm passionate, right? And so she looks at me and sort of pins me in this way that black girls do. And she said, "You know you're angry, Brittany." And all of a sudden I felt really exposed. But I also felt really empowered in that moment because I realized that she saw that rage as something that felt true, that something that she felt she could relate to and connect to. There was something authentic and sincere about it. And so I realized that my rage was real, was legitimate, and that it was helping me to be better at teaching, at being an educator, as opposed to diminishing that work.
Just another example of how teachers can learn from their students.
Absolutely.
As well as the other way around. So the subtitle of the book is A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower. Yes. Is the eloquent rage your superpower?
Yeah. So, you know, certainly I think it's the animating force of my superpower. Look, I really think that black feminism is a superpower. And that's what I love most about it, that I think it actually has the ability to change the world. But one of the reasons that black feminism works in that way is because it has allowed me to own rage as a legitimate emotion. Being a black woman, being a person caught at the intersection of both race and gender, and thinking about that in a variety of ways, it has allowed me to embrace that anger as something that I can have control over and that I can use to do good in the world, rather than allowing anger to be a destructive force.
I guess it's the few days to talk about superpower. I don't think the publisher was smart enough to release this book on the same, weekend as Black Panther.
Wakanda forever.
Did you see it yet?
I absolutely did.
What do you want to say about it?
I think it is amazing. I think that America deserves, but Black people in particular deserve movies that represent us in all of that gorgeous Black beauty, but also that ask us to think about possibility, to ask us to really delve deep and think about what would have been possible for Black people if they had not been colonized, right? And what is the relationship between African folks and diasporic Black people? What are our political responsibilities to each other? And look, we also deserve to see Black women kicking butt, right? The Dora Milaje are amazing, yes.
And in that context, Beyonce?
I mean, yeah, Beyonce is, you know, as I say in this book, my feminist muse. And I struggled with whether to say that, because in this moment of everyone wanting you to be woke and be hyper conscious, claiming a pop star as a feminist muse probably seems beside the point. But what I like about Beyonce is that she has been willing to grow in public. I've been a fan of hers for more than 20 years. We're around the same age. And I think that there's an authentic thing that she gets about feminism that really is core for me, and is the political analysis matters. And I do that in my day job. But for Beyonce, what she says is that her homegirls and her friendships with women are central to how she understands herself. And I think that that's a thing that we lose, because we get the political analysis right, but we still sometimes treat women terribly. And so I wanted to reclaim a more relational sense of what it means to live out our politics, and also a joyous sense. So I love that there can be a relational thing, and also a, like, you can go shake your thing at the club, right, and listen to Beyonce.
And so to get back to the Eloquent Rage, you write that for the 10 years since you had that interaction with your former student Erica, you've been trying to focus Eloquent Rage with precision. And the precision is a really interesting piece for me. I was thinking how unfocused rage might hurt the person feeling it, while precise rage might actually get something done.
Yeah, look, I didn't always have precision with it. So as a college kid, I was a hothead. I would get mad at my professors. I would walk out of class. Or, you know, conversely, I would feel misunderstood and have these crying, embarrassing meltdowns, all because of a sort of internal sense of deep injustice and rage. And so in being able to own it, then I learned that, one, you know, my thinking becomes really clear when I'm mad. There's a way in which the stakes are very clear politically when we're angry. The things that make us angry tell us something about what matters to us. And so I feel like digging in there and then trying to use that to set political priorities actually helps. But I also want to be clear, one of the things I talk about in this book is that I also saw rage as a destructive force in my life as a kid growing up in a house with an abusive parent. And so I learned about the destructive power of it, and that is why I'm so keen to harness it, not because I don't think that trying to suppress it is the problem, but I do think, for instance, that in this moment we're experiencing the ill effects of white rage being sort of not being used against us in ways that are not helpful. And what I'm hoping is that by empowering other groups of folks, people of color, Black folks, Black women, to own the legitimacy of their rage, maybe we can have a different kind of conversation.
It's interesting, when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, some Republicans tried to portray Michelle as a, quote, angry Black woman to somehow discredit the campaign.
Absolutely.
And yet when Trump's base emerged as angry white men, the media and sociologists bent over backwards to explain the root causes of their rage.
Absolutely. Look, Black rage has always been considered an illegitimate political emotion, and one of my core goals in this book is to say Black rage is legitimate. That is something that I've been writing about in the public really since the Ferguson explosion in 2014, is that one of the ways that we're going to move forward is that Americans have to grapple with the fact that if you give white supremacy free rein at the level of policy, at the level of rhetoric, as we're doing now, people who see themselves as human, who are human, and who have a sense of dignity are going to be upset about that, right? And when you then create no outlets for folks to be empowered in terms of political processes to try to create the world they want to see, then you will see that anger and rage used destructively. And when we see it with white folks, then we try to assuage it and think about it as part of our politics. When we see it with Black folks in particular, then let me be very frank. White people get scared. They try to suppress it. They try to police it. They try to make it look respectable. And there's a very particular reason why I call this book Eloquent Rage, not elegant rage, right? There's a difference in those words. I am not talking about rage being pretty. I am talking about rage being clear and expressive. What is the target? What is the cause? What is the problem? What is the injustice and injury that has been done? Because we cannot heal that which we will not name, own, and confront.
Our guest, if you're just joining us, who just got the first sustained applause for an answer in the Greene Space today, is Rutgers professor Brittany Cooper. Her new book is Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower. If you have a question for her here in the Greene Space, raise your hand. We may have time for a question or two on the phones as well at 212-433-WNYC, 433-9692. One of the things that enraged you enough that you sat out last year's Women's March was that white feminists didn't convince enough other white women to vote for Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
But the leaders of the Women's March were diverse. Why did you choose to sit that out rather than join forces with other women who were enraged at the election of Donald Trump?
Yeah, it's a good question and one that I'm grappling with, because certainly when the movement for Black Lives kicked off, I have issues with the way that Black men don't always support Black women, but I still was in the streets. So I was trying to think about the intersection and why I didn't feel compelled. One, I was fatigued and devastated about the election of Donald Trump, and so I decided on the day of the Women's March that I was going to go hang out with Black people, just as a healing mechanism. I also think that the women's movement is going to last and that there are going to be many opportunities to sort of participate. But one of the things that I really want to say right in this moment is that I'm not a Black feminist who wants to spend a lot of time pointing fingers at white feminists. I want white women to stop being racist. I think that that's white feminists' work to do if they actually are committed to the work of feminism. I'm interested in Black feminism because I think that it is the thing that draws us at all these different points of intersection together. And for me, it is a more positive, constructive kind of force. But I also think that even if you look beyond the election of 2016, if you look at many of the big elections of 2017, white women still voted in every one of those elections for the Republican candidate. Majority white women still voted for the Republican candidate in like the New Jersey governor's race, right? The Virginia governor's race, etc. So white feminists have got to see white women as a group of people that they can organize and that they feel responsibility for. As a Black feminist, I feel a responsibility for going into Black communities and saying that our racial liberation project is incomplete if we don't challenge patriarchy and homophobia, right? And so white feminists have to have that same analysis, that it's not enough to merely liberate women, that you've also got to challenge racism too.
That's two in a row. Let me note and promote that you will be at Greenlight Books in Prospect Lefferts Gardens tonight in conversation with Rebecca Traister from New York Magazine, a white feminist who's been writing a lot about Clinton's defeat and the post-Weinstein MeToo moment, and also writes about women's anger. So that should be really a great conversation. For one thing, Greenlight Books in Prospect Lefferts Gardens tonight. Do you have the time? I don't
7:30.
7:30, thank you. My question is, do you see a way for there to be someday one feminism, or is that the wrong question? Maybe there just need to be diverse strands of feminism, or can we solve white supremacy enough, at least among women, that there can be sort of a unified feminism?
I'm not interested in unity. I think it's too facile. I think that there's power in difference. The great Black feminist Audre Lorde taught me that and thinks about that in ways that I find useful. What I think that we can try to pursue with each other is solidarities. And that's harder work. It's slower work. It's relational work. But look, I think that the reality is that I don't always want to be in the streets with white feminists. Sometimes I want to sit down and have a conversation with Black women about what does it look like to get Black men on board with a solidarity project. And that's not a conversation that all feminists need to be having, right? And it can become quite complicated. And so a bad thing happens when white feminists sort of jump into conversations that are about Black men. And I think that we have this idea that we want a sort of multicultural unity, but I think that the reality is we need to have more honest political conversations about where we are, and we need to figure out the places and spaces where we can support each other and show up for each other. That is going to get us much farther than sort of this kind of pie in the sky unity that folks like to talk about.
Let me take a phone call for you. This is Janine in Springfield, Virginia, listening in from down there. Janine, you're on WNYC with Brittany Cooper. Hello.
Hi, Brian. How are you? I love your show.
Thank you.
And Professor Cooper, you are amazing. I actually live I moved from Park Slope to Crown Heights, and I'm part of a Black women's health movement called Girl Trek. And our
yes.
mission is to get 1 million Black women walking our neighborhoods this year by 2018. You got to come walk with us.
I do walk with you. I walk with you sometimes in Highland Park, New Jersey. Yes.
What? Girl Trek, what's up?
What's up?
The thing is, being a part of Girl Check has changed my life because I'm also an artist, I'm an actor, and most of my friends were white feminists. And since I've had a place, a safe space with Black women to process and to express my joy, my capacity for being an activist has grown 2,000%. My anger, though, I've had to cut out a lot of white friends because I no longer educate white women. I don't have time. I see that I need to help and support and be supported by Black women. And what you said by having a solidarity is amazing. Well, my question is, with Eloquent Rage, how can we turn that rage into precision so that I can work in solidarity instead of cutting white women off? And I don't cut off all white women because I have a lot of white women friends who are awesome and who are probably listening and do amazing work with. But I've cut out about 30% of my white female friends who've asked me stupid questions that I just can't. I don't have the time anymore to tolerate. I'm like, go Google it. So how can I be, how can we use this precision to move forward to have that solidarity?
Thank you for your question. You know, you're doing better than me because I have far less than, I cut out more like 90% of my white women friends. That's actually what's true. I've been writing about that conundrum, and I write about it in this book, that I grew up in a predominantly white school system, and I actually grew up having mostly white women for friends, white girls and white women. And then as I got to be an adult, those friendships became untenable because it's easy when you're a kid to gloss over sort of like that you're a Republican and a like deep evangelical in a way that's white supremacist. It's much harder when it's clear what the stakes are. So what I want to suggest is that I actually don't think that Black women have the responsibility to do any more emotional work around building friendships with white women. One of the things that I hope happens in this moment as white feminists sort of get their people is that they recognize that this is not about Black women's lack of willingness to be friends with white women. This is about Black women saying we're not going to do the emotional labor that it takes to be in these relationships anymore if it's not reciprocal. So the white women friends that I have, and I have just a couple, we commit to each other to do work for each other in a way that is reciprocal. And so one of the friends that I reconnected with, she hit me up and she said on social media, look, I don't want to raise racist children. And that is one of the reasons why this friendship matters to me. But she is also the friend who texts me and just says, I'm cheering for you. I hope you're doing good. I'm praying for you, right? So there is a way that she is bringing the things she can bring at a level of authentic connection, and then I can make the choice that there's some labor that I want to do around helping her to be anti-racist. And so I believe in committed friendships across racial borders, but I believe there has to be a negotiation and a real understanding that what Black women cannot be doing is emotional labor if white women are not really in the fight. In short, Black women can't want liberation for all women more than all women want it for themselves.
And Janine, thank you so much for your call. We just have a couple of minutes left in the show. I was surprised to read in the book that you came from religious conservatism. One line in the book about you at age 22 is, I was still far too much of a Christian zealot to be either pragmatic or feminist. Can you talk a little bit about your journey in that respect? Because that might have surprised some people who are hearing you for the first time.
Yeah, I'm from the Deep South. I grew up in the Black Baptist Church. My stepdad is a Baptist preacher, pastor, and I'm still a church girl. But what I am is a church girl committed to a progressive politic around religion and spirituality. One of the reasons for that, one of the reasons that I think this matters for feminism, feminism cannot speak to many Black women if it won't acknowledge the place for spiritual and the sacred. Because the reality is that many women of color, and particularly Black women, are an extremely religious demographic. So if we say that we think that feminism can change the world because it has a critique of patriarchy, then we got to be able to talk to Black girls who still go to church and who want to bring their Jesus along with their feminism. For me, those things are not incompatible. But part of what I'm trying to work through in this book and think about is what my journey to a more progressive theological ethic is. And I also want to push back against folks who think that to be critical or to be woke or to be radical means that you can't have a God concept, means you can't believe in a notion of the spiritual or the sacred. What I think it means is that you can't use your theology to beat up on people, do harm to people, injure people, and be violent. And I think that if you're going to be in a faith community, you have to be willing to own and be responsible for the violence that has been done in the name of the faith that you profess and proclaim, right? So I'm committed to that as a progressive Christian, but I'm also committed to being the worst possible Christian I can be.
And now that we've gotten all the way to God, we're going to end the show with Brittany Cooper, Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and Africana Studies at Rutgers, co-founder of the Crunk Feminist Collective, and author of the brand new Eloquent Rage, a black feminist discovers her superpower. And again, Brittany Cooper will be in conversation with Rebecca Traister tonight at 7:30 at the Green Light Bookstore in Prospect, Lefferts Gardens. That's 632 Flatbush Avenue. Professor Cooper, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.
And thanks to all of you who came to the Greene Space today. And thanks for listening, everyone. Brian Lehrer on WNYC.
Support for WNYC comes from the Guggenheim Museum, presenting the first comprehensive survey in the U.S. of work by contemporary artist Jan Vo. Featuring sculptures, photographs, and works on paper, Jan Vo, Take My Breath Away is on view